The sun scorched the wooden platform where Dolores Harrington stood, her trembling hand clutched tightly around her 5-year-old sister's small fingers. The crowd of men below stared up at them with cold, calculating eyes as the auctioneer's voice boomed across the dusty main street of Caldwell, Texas. It was 1875, and at 22, Dolores never imagined she would be standing on an auction block alongside little Annie, both of them being sold to the highest bidder after their parents' death left them with nothing but debts. What am I bid for these two fine females? The elder can cook, clean, and sew with the best of them. The little one's young enough to train up right, the auctioneer called, his voice carrying across the crowd of cowboys, businessmen, and ranch owners who had gathered in the small frontier town. Dolores fought back tears as she stared defiantly ahead. 3 days ago, they had been evicted from their family home, and the local banker who held their father's debts had decided the quickest way to recoup his losses was to sell the sisters as indentured servants. In the wild Texas frontier, such practices still happened in the shadows of the law, especially to those without protection. $20, came a gruff voice from the back. 30, called another. Dolores squeezed Annie's hand tighter, whispering, "It's going to be all right, little one." But she didn't believe her own words. The stories she'd heard of separated families and cruel masters haunted her thoughts. $50, shouted a man with a scar across his cheek, his hungry eyes fixed on Dolores in a way that made her skin crawl. $100, came a clear voice from the side of the crowd. The bidding fell silent as the crowd parted to reveal a tall cowboy leaning against a hitching post. His dark hat shadowed his face, but Dolores could see the determined set of his jaw. He stepped forward, spurs jingling with each deliberate step toward the auction block. $100, the cowboy repeated, pushing his hat back to reveal striking blue eyes that met Dolores's gaze directly, for both of them together. "Well now, Mr. Navarro," the auctioneer said with surprise. "That's generous of you." Xander Navarro's reputation preceded him. Owner of the Double N Ranch outside of town, he was known to be fair but formidable, a man who kept to himself but commanded respect across the county. "Going once," the auctioneer called, scanning the crowd for higher bids. The scarred man looked furious but remained silent. "Going twice, sold to Mr. Xander Navarro for $100. Dolores felt Annie's grip tighten painfully on her hand. Whatever fate awaited them at the Double N Ranch, at least they would face it together. Xander approached the platform, his expression unreadable as he handed the money to the auctioneer. Then he looked up at Dolores. "Miss, I'll give you both a home," he said simply. "No one's separating you two." Relief and wariness battled within Dolores as she helped Annie down the steps of the platform. "What exactly will be expected of us, Mr. Navarro?" she asked, her voice steady despite her fear. "I need a housekeeper," he replied. "My ranch hands can't cook worth a damn, and the place hasn't been properly cleaned since." He paused. "For a long time, you'll have your own room, both of you, and you'll be treated with respect." "And my sister," Dolores pressed, unwilling to leave anything to chance. His expression softened as he looked at Annie, whose wide eyes were taking in his tall frame with trepidation. "Children should be children, Miss Harrington. She can help you if she wants, learn her letters and play. I've got no use for child labor." As they walked toward his wagon parked at the end of the street, whispers followed them. Dolores kept her head high, though her cheeks burned with humiliation. She had been raised as the daughter of a respectable storekeeper, not someone to be bought and sold. "Don't listen to them," Xander said quietly. "People talk because they've got nothing better to do." He helped them into the wagon, ensuring Annie was secure before climbing up himself. As they left Caldwell behind, Dolores watched the town grow smaller, wondering what awaited them at the ranch and whether Xander Navarro's seemingly kind offer held hidden conditions. The ride was quiet for the first hour, with Annie eventually falling asleep against Dolores's side. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as they traveled through rolling hills dotted with mesquite trees and prickly pear cactus. "Mr. Navarro," Dolores finally broke the silence. I appreciate what you did back there, but I need to know the truth of our situation. Xander kept his eyes on the trail ahead. The truth is simple, Miss Harrington. I need help at the ranch, and you too needed a way out of that auction. I've never held with treating people like property. Yet you bought us, she pointed out, his jaw tightened, to keep you from worse fates. I've seen what happens to women sold to some of those men back there. He glanced at her. You're not my property. Consider this an employment arrangement. You'll be paid fair wages, and when you've worked off the $100, you're free to stay or go as you please. Dolores studied his profile, trying to determine if she could trust him. His features were weathered from years under the Texas sun, but there was something in the way he had gently handled Annie that gave her hope. Why would you do this for strangers? She asked. For a moment he remained silent. Let's just say I know what it's like to lose everything. He flicked the reins to urge the horses over a small rise. There it is, Double N Ranch. Below them stretched a modest but well-maintained ranch. A two-story house stood proudly among several outbuildings, corrals, and a barn. In the distance, cattle grazed on the open range. It's not much compared to some, Xander said, but it's home. As they approached, two ranch hands emerged from the barn, waving in greeting. Xander returned the gesture before stopping the wagon in front of the house. Those are my only permanent hands, Diego and Franklin. They bunk in the small cabin behind the barn. Other hands come and go with the seasons. He jumped down and offered a hand to help Dolores. She hesitated before accepting, stepping down with as much dignity as she could muster. She then reached back for Annie, who had awakened and was rubbing her eyes sleepily. Come on, I'll show you where you'll be staying, Xander said, leading them up the porch steps. The house was solid but Spartan, clearly a man's domain. The main floor consisted of a kitchen, dining area, and a sitting room with a stone fireplace. Upstairs were 4 bedrooms, one of which Xander indicated would be theirs. My room's at the end of the hall, the others for storage right now. He gestured to the room before them. It ain't fancy, but it's clean. The bedroom contained a double bed, a small dresser, and a rocking chair by the window that overlooked the property. A smaller bed had been tucked into the corner. Diego's wife helped get this ready when I sent word into town this morning that I might be bringing back help. He looked slightly uncomfortable. I know it's not much, it's more than we had yesterday, Dolores interrupted, feeling the first genuine relief since their parents' passing. Thank you, Mr. Navarro, he nodded awkwardly. Well, I'll let you two get settled. Supper's usually at sundown. Kitchen's yours now, so. He trailed off, then added, there should be supplies in the pantry. After he left, Dolores sat on the edge of the bed with Annie beside her. What do you think, little one? Shall we make this work for a while? Annie looked around the room, then back at her sister. Is he our new papa? The innocent question caught Dolores off guard. No, sweetheart, he's our employer. We're going to work here and make this our home for now. Annie nodded solemnly. He has kind eyes, like Papa did. Dolores hadn't noticed, but as she thought about it, perhaps there was a gentleness behind Xander Navarro's stern exterior. We should get cleaned up and see what we can make for supper, she said, pushing the thought aside. First impressions matter. The kitchen was better stocked than Dolores had dared hope. She found flour, lard, dried beans, salt pork, and even coffee. By the time the sun began to set, she had prepared a simple but hearty meal of beans, cornbread, and fried salt pork. The men arrived as she was setting the table, Annie carefully placing forks beside each plate. Something smells mighty good, Franklin said, removing his hat as he entered. He was an older man with a gray streaked beard and kind eyes. Diego was younger, perhaps 30, with a quick smile. Xander came in last, freshly washed, his damp hair combed back from his forehead. He paused in the doorway, taking in the transformed kitchen and the table set with the meal. Miss Harrington, you didn't have to go to all this trouble on your first day, he said, though his eyes revealed appreciation. It's no trouble, and please call me Dolores. She gestured to the table. Sit, all of you, it's nothing special, but it's hot. The meal passed with polite conversation, the men clearly on their best behavior. Annie watched them all with wide eyes, particularly fascinated by Diego's stories of roping cattle. Have you always lived in Caldwell, Miss Dolores? Franklin asked between bites of cornbread. Most of my life, she replied. Our parents moved there when I was about Annie's age. My father ran the mercantile until. She trailed off, unwilling to revisit the painful details of his death from pneumonia 3 months prior, followed by their mothers passing from grief and exhaustion just weeks later. The Harrington store, Xander nodded in recognition. Good man, your father. Dolores looked at him in surprise. You knew him, did business with him whenever I came to town. Fair prices, honest weights. Xander's face darkened. Shame what Wilkins did after he passed. Wilkins? Dolores's hand tightened around her fork. The banker. Bought up your father's debts for pennies on the dollar, from what I heard. Xander's voice was tight with controlled anger. Man's been doing that all over the county, forcing families out, then reselling the properties at a profit. The revelation that her family's tragedy was part of a calculated scheme made Dolores's blood run cold. Is that common knowledge? Not exactly, Franklin interjected, but folks talk and some of us listen. The conversation shifted to ranch matters, but Dolores's mind remained on Wilkins and his predatory practices. She wondered how many other families had been torn apart by his greed. After supper, the hands thanked her for the meal and departed for their cabin. Xander helped clear the table despite her protests, and Annie, exhausted from the day's events, fell asleep in her chair. She's had a long day, Xander said softly, watching as Dolores lifted the sleeping child. We both have. Dolores adjusted Annie in her arms. I should put her to bed. Of course. He hesitated, then added, Dolores, I want you to know that what happened today, I don't hold with it. If I could have found another way to help you both, but you couldn't, she finished for him. And I'm grateful, truly, at least we're together and safe. He nodded, seeming relieved by her understanding. Good night, then. Good night, Mr. Navarro, Xander, he corrected. If I'm calling you Dolores seems only fair. With a small smile, she carried Annie upstairs, feeling the weight of the day settling on her shoulders. As she tucked her sister into bed, she wondered what tomorrow would bring in this new life that had been thrust upon them. The following weeks established a routine that brought a measure of stability to Dolores and Annie's lives. Dolores rose early each morning to prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, who appreciated her cooking far more than they'd ever enjoyed their own attempts at sustenance. Annie quickly became the darling of the ranch, trailing after the men when they weren't busy, asking endless questions about horses, cattle, and life on the range. Xander proved to be a fair employer, never demanding more than Dolores could reasonably manage. He kept mostly to himself, spending long days working alongside his men, returning to the house tired and often silent. Yet Dolores noticed how he always had time for Annie, answering her questions patiently, and sometimes bringing her small treasures from the range, a uniquely shaped stone, a hawk feather, or a harmless snake skin. As June turned to July, the Texas heat intensified, making the work more challenging. One particularly scorching afternoon, Dolores was hanging laundry when she saw Xander returning early, his horse at a walk rather than his usual brisk trot. Is everything all right? She called as he approached the corral. He dismounted slowly, and she noticed him wince as he hit the ground. Just fine, he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. When he turned, she saw the dark stain spreading across his left shoulder. You're hurt. It's nothing. Steer caught me with a horn when we were separating the herd. He led his horse toward the barn, and Dolores hurried after him. That's not nothing. You're bleeding through your shirt. I've had worse. Despite his dismissal, he swayed slightly as he reached the barn door. Dolores rushed forward to steady him. Stubborn man, come to the house and let me tend to that before you bleed to death from nothing. To her surprise, he didn't argue further, allowing her to guide him to the kitchen. Annie was napping upstairs, giving Dolores the quiet she needed to work. Take off your shirt, she instructed, filling a basin with water from the pump. Xander hesitated, then complied with a grimace of pain. As the fabric pulled away from the wound, fresh blood flowed from a jagged 4-inch gash across his shoulder. Dolores worked efficiently, cleaning the wound with water and whiskey, which made Xander hiss through clenched teeth. You need stitches, she said, examining the depth of the cut. You know how to do that? He asked, his blue eyes watching her face. My mother taught me. She was a midwife before she married my father. Dolores threaded a needle she'd sterilized in the flame of an oil lamp. This will hurt. I trust you, he said simply. Those 3 words hung in the air between them as she carefully stitched the wound closed. Xander remained stoically silent throughout, though she felt the tension in his muscles beneath her fingers. There, she said finally, tying off the thread. Keep it clean and try not to pull those stitches. Thank you. He looked down at her handiwork, then back to her face. You have skilled hands. My mother would be pleased to hear that. Dolores began clearing away the bloody cloths. She always said healing was a gift passed from mother to daughter. What about your sister? Will she learn too? Dolores smiled softly. Perhaps, though Annie seems more interested in horses than humans at the moment. She's a natural with them, Xander agreed. Yesterday she was telling Diego how to properly bridle his mount. The image made Dolores laugh. She's always been fearless, even as a baby. As Xander reached for his torn shirt, Dolores stopped him. Wait here, I'll find you something clean to wear. She returned with one of his spare shirts and helped him ease it over his injured shoulder. Standing this close, she could smell the sun and earth on his skin, mixed with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp bite of whiskey. Their eyes met for a long moment, and something unspoken passed between them. The sound of small feet on the stairs broke the spell. Annie appeared, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Xander, did you bring me a treasure today? He smiled, the pain in his eyes momentarily forgotten. Not today, little one, but tomorrow, if you help your sister with the dishes after breakfast, I might find something special. Annie's face lit up. I promise. That evening, after Annie was asleep, Dolores returned downstairs to find Xander sitting on the porch, staring out at the star-filled sky. She brought him a cup of coffee and sat in the chair beside him. How's your shoulder? She asked. Sore, but better. You do good work. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the night sounds of the prairie surrounding them. May I ask you something personal? Dolores finally ventured. He tensed slightly but nodded. You said you knew what it was like to lose everything. What did you mean? Xander took a long drink of his coffee before answering. I was married once, he said, his voice low. Her name was Margaret. We came out here from Missouri with big dreams and not much else. He paused, the memory clearly painful. Second winter here, a fever took her and our unborn child. That was 5 years ago. I'm so sorry, Dolores said softly, understanding now the shadows that sometimes crossed his face. After that, I threw myself into building this place, figured if I worked hard enough, I wouldn't have time to remember. He shook his head. Doesn't work that way, though. No, it doesn't, she agreed, thinking of her own parents. When I saw you and Annie on that auction block, something in me couldn't just stand by. He turned to look at her directly. No one should have to lose family that way. Dolores felt tears prick her eyes at his honesty. Thank you for telling me. Haven't talked about her in a long time, he admitted. Feels strange, but not bad. He set his empty cup aside. What about you? There must have been suitors in Caldwell, she smiled ruefully. A few before my parents died. Afterward, they disappeared faster than morning dew in August. Her expression hardened. Turns out a penniless woman with a child to care for isn't considered much of a catch. Their loss, Xander said simply. The directness of his statement caught her off guard, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the summer night. In the weeks that followed, Dolores found herself watching Xander more closely. She noticed the gentleness with which he treated Annie, the respect he showed to his men, and the quiet competence he brought to everything he did. He was nothing like the rough cowboys who had bid on her and Annie in Caldwell, men who viewed women as possessions rather than partners. August brought a violent thunderstorm that rattled the windows of the ranch house and sent lightning crackling across the sky. Annie crawled into Dolores's bed, trembling with each boom of thunder. It's just the angels bowling, Dolores soothed, repeating what their mother had always told them. They must be very angry tonight, Annie whispered. A particularly loud crack shook the house, followed by shouts from outside. Moments later, heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs and Xander appeared in their doorway, rain dripping from his slicker. Lightning hit the barn, he said urgently. Fire's spreading fast. Diego and Franklin are trying to get the horses out, but I need help. Dolores was on her feet immediately. Annie, stay here. No. Annie clung to her sister. Don't leave me alone in the storm. Xander made a quick decision. Bring her. She can stay in the wagon away from the fire. But hurry. They raced down the stairs and out into the deluge. The barn was partially engulfed in flames, orange light casting eerie shadows through the curtain of rain. Diego and Franklin were leading panicked horses from the burning structure. Take Annie to the wagon, Dolores told Xander, already moving toward the barn. I'll help with the horses. Dolores, he began, but she was already running toward the barn, her nightdress quickly soaked through. Inside, smoke burned her eyes and throat as she navigated to the stalls where two more horses whinnied in terror. She managed to get a halter on one, a gentle mare named Daisy, and led her toward the door. As she turned back for the second horse, a burning beam crashed down, blocking her path. Dolores, Xander's voice called from somewhere beyond the smoke. Get out now. There's still one horse, she shouted back, trying to find a way around the flames. Suddenly, Xander was beside her, pulling her back. Too late, the roof's coming down. As if to punctuate his words, another beam cracked ominously above them. Xander grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the door just as the structure began to collapse. They burst out into the rain, coughing and stumbling, as behind them the barn roof caved in with a thunderous crash. Annie's scream cut through the noise as she ran from the wagon toward them. Dolores knelt in the mud to catch her sister, holding her close. I'm all right, little one, I'm all right. Through the rain, she looked up at Xander, who stood watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. His face was streaked with soot, his clothes soaked and singed, yet in that moment he looked to Dolores like some kind of guardian angel. You could have been killed, he said hoarsely when their eyes met. So could you, she countered, rising to her feet with Annie in her arms. Diego approached, leading the last rescued horses to a corral. Everyone's accounted for, he reported. We lost the barn, but not a single animal. As the adrenaline began to fade, Dolores became aware of her shivering. The August night was warm, but the rain had chilled her skin, and the thin cotton of her nightdress clung to her frame. Xander noticed immediately. He shrugged off his slicker and wrapped it around her and Annie. Let's get you both inside. There's nothing more we can do here tonight. Back in the house, Dolores put Annie to bed with promises to stay close. The child was exhausted by fear and excitement and fell asleep almost immediately. Downstairs, Dolores found Xander sitting at the kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses before him. He had changed into dry clothes but hadn't bothered to clean the soot from his face. Annie asleep? He asked as she entered. Dolores nodded, taking the seat across from him. She had changed as well, combing out her wet hair so it hung down her back in damp waves. He pushed a glass toward her, and she accepted it without comment, taking a small sip. The liquor burned a path down her throat, warming her from within. Thank you, she said after a moment. For coming after me. Xander stared into his own glass. When I saw you run into that barn, he shook his head. Felt like my heart stopped. The rawness in his voice made her look up sharply. Their eyes met across the table, and the intensity in his gaze took her breath away. I couldn't leave the animal, she explained softly. I know. A rueful smile touched his lips. That's the kind of woman you are, brave, too brave sometimes, says the man who ran into a burning barn after me. His smile faded. Dolores, he trailed off, seeming to struggle with his words. These past months, having you and Annie here, it's changed things, changed me. Dolores felt her heart quicken. Changed how? The ranch was just a place before, now it feels like a home again. He took another drink, then set his glass down firmly. I need to say something, and I want you to know you're free to answer however you choose. Your position here isn't dependent on your response. She nodded, sensing the importance of what was to come. You paid off your $100 weeks ago with your work here, he said. You're not indebted to me or anyone else. You and Annie could leave tomorrow if you wanted to. Is that what you want? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. God, no. The words burst from him with unexpected force. What I want, what I'm trying to say badly, is that I care for you both, more than I thought possible after Margaret. He met her eyes directly. I'm not asking for anything now, just wanted you to know where I stand. Dolores reached across the table and took his hand. I care for you too, Xander, so does Annie. The hope that flared in his eyes made her heart ache with tenderness. You do? How could we not? You saved us in every way a person can be saved. She squeezed his hand. But if there's to be anything between us, it needs to be because we choose it, not because of gratitude or obligation. He nodded slowly. That's fair. I can wait, Dolores, however long you need. The sincerity in his voice made her smile. I don't think it will be very long at all. 2 days after the fire, Dolores was preparing dinner when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Looking out the window, she saw a conveyance she didn't recognize coming up the drive, a single man at the reins. Xander, she called, wiping her hands on her apron. Someone's coming. He appeared from his study, where he'd been going over the ranch books. One look at the approaching wagon made his expression darken. Stay inside with Annie, he said tersely, reaching for his hat. Who is it? Dolores asked, alarmed by his reaction. Wilkins. The name sent a chill down her spine. She watched from the window as Xander strode out to meet the banker as he pulled his wagon to a stop. Elias Wilkins was a corpulent man with small, calculating eyes and hands that never seemed to stop moving. He climbed down from his wagon with surprising agility for one of his size. Navarro, he greeted, his voice carrying clearly through the open window. Fine day for a drive. What brings you out this way, Wilkins? Xander's tone was coolly polite but held an unmistakable edge. Business, my good man, always business. Wilkins removed his hat, revealing a balding pate. I understand you acquired the Harrington girls some months back. Dolores's hand tightened on the curtain at hearing herself, and Annie referred to as acquisitions. Miss Harrington is my housekeeper, Xander corrected firmly. What's your interest? Well, there's been some talk in town. Wilkins smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. Some folks wondering if you've properly registered your arrangement with the authorities. Indentured servitude requires proper documentation, as I'm sure you know. There's no indentured servitude here, Xander replied evenly. Miss Harrington is a free woman employed at fair wages. Is that so? Wilkins raised his eyebrows. Then you won't mind if I speak with her myself. I have a proposition that might interest her. Before Xander could respond, Dolores stepped out onto the porch. She couldn't hide in the house while this man discussed her fate. Mr. Wilkins, she called, walking toward the men with her head held high. You can speak to me directly. Wilkins's smile widened as he turned toward her. Miss Harrington, looking well, I see. Ranch life agrees with you. What proposition do you have for me? She asked, ignoring his false pleasantries. Straight to business, I like that. He clasped his hands over his ample belly. I've come to offer you a position in town. My wife requires a companion, and I thought of you immediately. The wage would be generous, and your sister could attend the school in Caldwell. Dolores didn't trust his sudden benevolence for a moment. How strange that you didn't make this offer before putting us on the auction block. Wilkins had the grace to look momentarily discomfited. A regrettable necessity at the time. Business can sometimes appear heartless, my dear. Not appear, Xander interjected coldly. Be heartless, ignoring him, Wilkins pressed on. What do you say, Miss Harrington? A respectable position in town must surely be preferable to this. He gestured dismissively at the ranch around them. This, Dolores replied firmly, is where Annie and I have found happiness again. Thank you for your offer, but I must decline. Wilkins's pleasant facade slipped slightly. Perhaps you should consider carefully before refusing. There are still questions about your father's outstanding debts that could be problematic. Are you threatening Miss Harrington? Xander stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun on his hip. Merely stating facts, Wilkins replied smoothly. Business is business, after all. Dolores felt anger rise within her. My father's debts were settled when you sold our home for twice what he owed. You've had your pound of flesh, Mr. Wilkins. I suggest you return to town and leave us be. The banker's face reddened. You're making a mistake, girl. Navarro here can't protect you from what exactly? Xander interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet. Are you planning something I should know about, Wilkins? The tension between the two men was palpable. Finally, Wilkins replaced his hat and stepped back toward his wagon. "I can see my generosity is wasted here. A pity." He climbed onto the seat. "Remember my words, Miss Harrington. Opportunities don't come twice in this life." As he drove away, Dolores released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "What was that about?" Xander's expression was grim. "I don't know, but I don't like it. Wilkins doesn't make social calls without a purpose. Do you think he'll cause trouble? Maybe, but whatever he's planning, we'll face it together." He looked down at her, his eyes softening. "If that's what you want," Dolores nodded. "It is. This is our home now, Annie's and mine. We won't be driven away again." The determination in her voice brought a smile to Xander's face. "No, we won't let that happen." As they walked back to the house together, Dolores felt a sense of rightness settle over her. Despite Wilkins's veiled threats, she knew she had made the correct choice. The Double N Ranch had become home in a way she hadn't thought possible after losing her parents and the life she had known. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Annie curled up between them with a book Xander had brought her from town. Dolores found herself studying Xander's profile. The strong line of his jaw, the small scar near his temple, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes when he smiled, all had become dear to her in ways she couldn't have imagined that day on the auction block. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, catching her gaze. "I was just thinking about how life takes unexpected turns," she replied. 3 months ago, I thought my world had ended. Now," she looked down at Annie, who was sounding out words with fierce concentration, "now I can see a future again." His hand found hers on the arm of the rocking chair, his calloused fingers covering hers gently. "A good future," he agreed. The warmth of his touch and the promise in his eyes made her heart swell with emotion. Whatever Wilkins might be planning, whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew they would face them together. September brought cooler temperatures and the start of roundup season. The ranch grew busier as additional hands arrived to help gather the cattle that had grazed across the open range all summer. Dolores found herself cooking for 12 men instead of 3, rising before dawn to prepare hearty breakfasts and staying up late to ensure provisions were ready for the next day. Despite her exhaustion, she felt a deep satisfaction in her role. The cowboys treated her with respect that bordered on reverence, especially after tasting her apple pies and sourdough biscuits. Annie thrived amid the activity, appointed herself official water carrier during mealtimes, and solemnly delivered cups to the grateful men. Xander was often gone from dawn until dusk, returning covered in dust and exhaustion, but always taking time to tell Annie a short story before she went to bed. His relationship with Dolores had evolved into something warm and promising, though propriety and the constant presence of others limited their moments alone together. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into the roundup, Xander returned earlier than usual. Dolores was in the kitchen, preparing the next day's bread dough when he appeared in the doorway. "Put on your good dress," he said without preamble. "We're going to town." She looked up in surprise, flour dusting her hands. "Town, all of us," he nodded. "There's a harvest dance tonight at the town hall. Thought Annie might enjoy the music and you could use a break from cooking." The prospect of an evening away from the ranch was unexpectedly appealing. "What about the men's supper?" "Already handled. Mrs. Peterson from the neighboring ranch is sending over enough stew to feed an army." "You've thought of everything," she said, a smile spreading across her face. "Tried to." He looked almost boyishly eager. "So you'll come, of course. Annie will be thrilled." An hour later, they were in the wagon headed for Caldwell, Annie bouncing with excitement in her best dress, a pale blue frock that Dolores had made from fabric Xander had brought from town. Dolores herself wore a green dress that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes, her hair arranged in a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck. Xander, dressed in clean denims, a white shirt, and a black vest, kept glancing at her as he drove, admiration evident in his gaze. "You look beautiful," he said quietly when Annie was distracted by a jackrabbit darting across the road. "Thank you," Dolores replied, a blush warming her cheeks. "You clean up rather nicely yourself." The town hall was lit with lanterns, and the sounds of fiddle music spilled into the street as they arrived. Farmers, ranchers, and townspeople had gathered for the annual celebration, and the atmosphere was festive. As they entered, Dolores felt eyes turn toward them. It was her first time back in Caldwell since the auction, and she steeled herself for whispers and stares. But to her surprise, several women approached immediately to greet her warmly. "Dolores Harrington, it's so good to see you." Mrs. Bennet, the minister's wife, clasped her hands. "We've been wondering how you and little Annie have been faring." "Very well, thank you," Dolores replied, touched by the genuine concern. "Mr. Navarro's been telling us how wonderfully you run his household," added Mrs. Thompson, the blacksmith's wife. "Said his place hasn't been so well managed in years." Dolores glanced at Xander, who shrugged slightly, a hint of color in his cheeks. "Just telling the truth," he said. The evening progressed pleasantly. Annie was swept up by other children her age, playing games in the corner under the watchful eyes of the older girls. Dolores found herself surrounded by townswomen, catching up on local news and accepting invitations to join sewing circles and social gatherings. "It seems you're quite popular," Xander commented when they finally had a moment alone near the refreshment table. "I'm as surprised as you are," she admitted. "I thought after the auction. People have short memories when it comes to scandal," he said. "And longer ones for a person's character. Your family was respected here for years." The music shifted to a waltz, and Xander extended his hand. "Would you do me the honor?" Dolores placed her hand in his. "I'd like that very much." He led her to the dance floor, his hand settling respectfully at her waist as they began to move with the music. Dolores had learned to dance at local gatherings before her parents' deaths, but she had forgotten the simple joy of it. Xander proved to be a competent partner, guiding her smoothly through the steps. "Where did you learn to dance?" she asked, surprised by his skill. "Margaret insisted I learn before our wedding," he replied with a small smile. "Said she wouldn't have a husband who couldn't waltz with her properly." The mention of his late wife didn't bring the usual shadow to his eyes, Dolores noticed. Instead, there was a gentle fondness in his voice, the kind that comes when grief has softened into cherished memory. "She sounds like a wise woman," Dolores said. She was. His eyes met hers directly. "She would have liked you, I think." The simple statement touched Dolores deeply. Before she could respond, however, a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. Elias Wilkins had arrived, his wife a thin, nervous-looking woman on his arm. His gaze swept the room and fixed on Dolores and Xander with unmistakable displeasure. "Ignore him," Xander murmured, continuing to guide her through the dance. But Wilkins was not so easily dismissed. As the music ended, he made his way deliberately toward them, stopping directly in their path as they left the dance floor. "Miss Harrington," he greeted with false cordiality. "How unexpected to see you here. I wasn't aware Mr. Navarro allowed his employees such liberties." Before Dolores could respond, Xander stepped slightly forward. "Miss Harrington is here as my guest, Wilkins. I'd appreciate if you'd remember that." Of course, of course." The banker's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Though some might find it unusual for a bachelor to appear so publicly with a woman in his employ. People do talk." "Let them," Dolores said firmly. "I have nothing to hide, nor does Mr. Navarro." Wilkins turned his attention to her, his expression calculating. "Indeed. Then perhaps you wouldn't mind explaining the nature of your arrangement to the good Reverend Bennet. He was just asking me about it, expressing some concerns." Dolores felt heat rise to her face, not from embarrassment but from anger. "Our arrangement is honest employment, Mr. Wilkins." Unlike some business dealings in this town, the banker's face darkened. "Careful, Miss Harrington, slander is a serious offense." "So is fraud," Xander interjected quietly, "and intimidation." A tense silence fell between them, broken only when Mrs. Wilkins timidly touched her husband's arm. "Elias, they're serving the punch now. You said you were thirsty." With visible effort, Wilkins composed himself. "Another time, then." He nodded curtly and allowed his wife to lead him away. "I'm sorry," Xander said when they were alone again. "I should have expected he'd be here." Dolores shook her head. You have nothing to apologize for, but I'm beginning to understand why he came to the ranch that day. He's worried about his reputation. With good reason, Xander agreed. Word's been spreading about his business practices. The Petersons nearly lost their ranch to him last year, and they're not the only ones. What can he do to us? Dolores asked, suddenly concerned for their safety. Nothing, if I have anything to say about it. Xander's expression was resolute, but we should be cautious. The remainder of the evening passed without further incident, though Dolores was aware of Wilkins watching them from across the room. When it came time to leave, Xander collected a sleepy Annie, who had danced herself into exhaustion with the other children. As they walked to their wagon, Reverend Bennett approached them. "Miss Harrington, Mr. Navarro," he called. "A moment, if you please." Dolores tensed, wondering if Wilkins had indeed poisoned the minister against them. "I wanted to speak with you privately," Bennett said, lowering his voice. "Mr. Wilkins came to me earlier this evening with some insinuations about your living arrangement." "Reverend," Xander began, but Bennett held up a hand. "Please, let me finish. I've known the Harrington family for many years, and you, Xander, since you came to the territory. I told Wilkins in no uncertain terms that I trust in the integrity of you both." He smiled kindly. "That said, if there were to be a more permanent arrangement between you two, I would be honored to officiate." Dolores felt her cheeks warm at the minister's gentle hint. Beside her, Xander cleared his throat. "Thank you, Reverend, that's good to know, just something to consider." Bennett nodded to them both. "Good night and safe journey home." As they drove back to the ranch under a canopy of stars, Annie asleep between them, Dolores found herself contemplating the Reverend's words. A permanent arrangement marriage was something she had thought about with increasing frequency in recent weeks. But were her feelings for Xander strong enough to commit to such a step? And did he feel the same way about her? "You're quiet," Xander observed, breaking the comfortable silence. "Just thinking about what Reverend Bennett said," she admitted. Xander's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "Ah. It was presumptuous of him," she added quickly, not wanting to make Xander uncomfortable. "Was it?" He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful in the moonlight. "I've been considering the same thing myself, if I'm being honest." Dolores's heart quickened. "You have?" "Yes." He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "But I don't want to rush you, Dolores. There's no hurry to decide anything." She appreciated his consideration, but felt the need to be equally honest. "Xander, when I think about my future, about Annie's future, I can't imagine it without you in it." His profile softened at her words. "I feel the same way." He reached across Annie to briefly touch Dolores's hand. "Let's talk more about this when we're home. Some conversations deserve more than a wagon ride can offer." Home. The word filled Dolores with warmth. The Double N Ranch had truly become home in a way she hadn't thought possible when she first arrived. And Xander. Xander had become the center of that home, the foundation upon which she could imagine building a future. The following morning dawned clear and crisp, hinting at the approaching fall. Dolores rose early as usual to prepare breakfast for the hands, but found Xander already in the kitchen, coffee brewing on the stove. "You're up early," she remarked, tying her apron around her waist. "Couldn't sleep much," he admitted. "Too much on my mind." She busied herself with gathering ingredients for biscuits, aware of his eyes following her movements. "About what Reverend Bennett said, partly." He poured a cup of coffee and set it near her on the counter. "But also about Wilkins. I don't trust him to leave us be." Dolores paused in her work, turning to face him. "What do you think he'll do?" "I'm not sure," Xander admitted, "but men like him don't take perceived slights lightly, and last night at the dance he felt slighted." "Because people saw me as your equal, not your servant," she concluded. "Exactly." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of his concern. "I've been thinking about how to protect you and Annie if he tries something." "We're not helpless, Xander," she reminded him gently, "but I appreciate your concern." He smiled at that. "I know you're not helpless. You're the strongest woman I've ever known. But Wilkins has influence in this county, and I want to make sure he can't use it against you." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats caught their attention. It was too early for casual visitors, and the hands were already at the bunkhouse. "Stay here," Xander said, his hand automatically checking for the gun at his hip before he headed to the door. Dolores followed anyway, standing in the doorway as Xander stepped onto the porch. A rider was approaching at a gallop, and as he drew closer, she recognized Franklin, who had gone into town the previous evening. "Boss," Franklin called as he reined in his horse. "Trouble coming. Wilkins is gathering men, heard them planning at the saloon last night." Xander's posture stiffened. "Planning what exactly?" Franklin dismounted, his expression grim. "Said something about teaching you a lesson about proper respect. They were drinking heavy, but Wilkins was putting money in their hands. I count at least 6 men, maybe more." "When?" Xander's voice was calm, but Dolores could see the tension in his shoulders. "Today, likely. I rode back as soon as I could slip away without being noticed." Dolores felt a cold knot of fear form in her stomach. "What do they intend to do?" Franklin glanced at her apologetically. "Nothing good, Miss Dolores. There was talk about taking you and the little one back to town. Said you weren't properly contracted and belonged back at the auction block." "That's ridiculous," she said, anger replacing fear. "I'm a free woman, not property to be claimed." "Wilkins doesn't see it that way," Franklin replied, "and he's convinced others to back his play." Xander turned to her, his expression resolute. "Get Annie. Pack only what you need. We're leaving." "Leaving?" Dolores stared at him in confusion. "This is our home. We can't just abandon it." "Not abandoning," he clarified. "Strategic retreat. I know these hills better than Wilkins and his men ever will. We'll go to the line cabin up in the north pasture until I can get word to the marshal in Fort Worth." Dolores understood the logic but hated the idea of being driven from their home by threats. "Xander, we can't let him win like this." "This isn't about winning, Dolores. It's about keeping you and Annie safe." His eyes met hers, fierce with protective determination. "Please." The single word spoken with such intensity convinced her. "All right, give me 10 minutes." She hurried upstairs, waking Annie with gentle urgency and helping her dress. The child, sensing the tension, asked few questions as Dolores packed a small bag with essential clothing and the rag doll Xander had brought her from town months ago. When they returned downstairs, Xander had the wagon ready, loaded with supplies, and his rifle prominently displayed on the seat. Diego had joined them and was deep in conversation with Xander and Franklin. "The other hands have gone to warn neighboring ranches," Diego explained as Dolores approached. "If Wilkins thinks he can start taking people's property by force, every rancher in the county has reason to be concerned." "You two head to the Petersons," Xander instructed the men. "Tell them what's happening and ask if they'll send a rider to Fort Worth. Marshal Taylor needs to know about this." "What about you?" Franklin asked. "We'll be safe at the line cabin. No one knows these hills like I do." Xander lifted Annie into the wagon, then helped Dolores up. "Be careful, boss," Diego said, his expression serious. "Men like Wilkins are dangerous because they believe they're in the right." "I know." Xander checked his pistol before climbing up beside Dolores. "Keep yourselves safe." "That's an order." As they drove away from the ranch house, Dolores looked back at the place that had become home. The sight of it growing smaller in the distance brought an ache to her heart, along with a fierce determination to return. "We'll come back," Xander promised, reading her thoughts. "Wilkins won't take this place from us." "Us." The word wrapped around Dolores like a blanket, providing comfort despite their circumstances. Whatever happened, they would face it together. The journey to the line cabin took several hours, following trails that grew increasingly rugged as they climbed into the hills. Annie, initially excited by what she viewed as an adventure, eventually fell asleep against Dolores's side, lulled by the rocking motion of the wagon. "How much farther?" Dolores asked as the sun climbed higher in the sky. "Not far now," Xander replied, guiding the horses through a narrow pass between limestone outcroppings. "Just beyond that ridge." The line cabin appeared a short time later, a sturdy if modest structure built against the side of a hill. A small spring bubbled nearby, and scrubby pine trees provided some shade. It was clear the cabin was used primarily during roundups when the men needed shelter while working this remote part of the ranch. "It's not much," Xander said apologetically as he helped Dolores down. "But it's solid and defensible." The interior was basic: a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and 2 narrow bunks built into the wall. A few supplies lined shelves along one wall, evidence of its utilitarian purpose. "It's perfect," Dolores declared, already assessing what needed to be done to make it comfortable for their stay. "How long do you think we'll need to be here?" Xander set their bags on the table. "Hard to say. It will take at least 3 days for word to reach the marshal and for him to ride out here, maybe a week total to be safe." Annie, now awake, explored the small cabin with interest. "Can I sleep on the top bunk?" she asked, seemingly unbothered by their sudden relocation. "Of course you can, little one," Xander replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. While Dolores and Annie set about making the cabin more livable, Xander brought in the supplies from the wagon and then took the horses to a small corral hidden among the trees. "There's good grazing and water here," he explained upon his return. "The horses will be comfortable." As evening approached, Dolores prepared a simple meal from the supplies they had brought. The 3 of them ate at the small table, maintaining a cheerful conversation for Annie's benefit, though the adults frequently exchanged concerned glances over her head. After the meal, Xander stepped outside to check the surroundings while Dolores settled Annie into the top bunk with her doll. "Are we hiding, Dolores?" Annie asked as her sister tucked the blanket around her. Dolores hesitated, unwilling to lie but not wanting to frighten the child. "Yes, in a way, but it's more like a game of strategy. Xander knows this is the best place for us to be right now." "Because of the bad banker," Annie's perception sometimes startled Dolores. "Yes, sweetheart, but don't worry. Xander will keep us safe and soon the marshal will come and make everything right." Annie nodded, accepting this with the simple faith of childhood. "I like it here. It's like we're having an adventure." "That's right, an adventure." Dolores kissed her forehead. "Now get some sleep. Adventures require plenty of rest." When Annie's breathing had evened into sleep, Dolores stepped outside to join Xander, who was sitting on a rough-hewn bench beside the cabin door, his rifle across his knees. "She's asleep," Dolores said softly, sitting beside him. "Good." He continued, scanning the darkening landscape. "She's handling this well. Children are remarkably adaptable." Dolores drew her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "But I worry about what will happen if Wilkins doesn't back down." Xander turned to look at her, his face half shadowed in the twilight. "What do you mean?" "Even if the marshal comes and stops whatever Wilkins is planning now, what's to prevent him from trying again, or finding some other way to cause trouble?" she sighed. "As long as Annie and I are vulnerable, he can use us against you." Xander was quiet for a long moment. Then he set the rifle aside and took her hands in his. "There's a way to remove that vulnerability," he said, his voice low and serious. "Something I've been wanting to ask you anyway, though I'd planned a more appropriate setting." Dolores's heart began to beat faster as she realized what he was suggesting. "Xander, marry me, Dolores," he said simply. "Not just for protection, though that would come with it. Marry me because I love you, because I can't imagine my life without you and Annie in it. Because the thought of losing you terrifies me more than any threat Wilkins could make." The directness of his proposal, so like the man himself, brought tears to Dolores's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have since that first night at the ranch when you promised Annie that children should be children." Hope brightened his face. "Is that a yes?" "It is." She squeezed his hands. "But I want you to be certain. Annie and I come as a package. She'll be your responsibility too." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he assured her. "Annie has claimed a piece of my heart from the beginning." Their kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with the emotion of months of growing feelings. When they finally pulled apart, Dolores rested her forehead against his, savoring the moment despite their precarious situation. "When we return to the ranch," Xander said, "we'll go straight to Reverend Bennett. No more waiting." "I'd like that." Dolores smiled. "But first, we have to deal with Wilkins." "First things first," he agreed, picking up his rifle again. "You should get some rest. I'll take the first watch." "Wake me in a few hours," she insisted. "You need sleep too." He nodded, though she suspected he might let her sleep through the night. Stubborn, protective man. But now he was her stubborn, protective man, and the thought filled her with warmth as she went inside to lie down on the lower bunk. Despite her concerns about what tomorrow might bring, Dolores fell asleep with a sense of hope. Whatever challenges they faced, they would face them together as a family. The next 3 days passed in a strange combination of domestic tranquility and vigilant tension. During daylight hours, they established a routine. Dolores tending to the cabin and preparing meals, Xander checking the perimeter and hunting for fresh meat, and Annie exploring the immediate surroundings under their watchful eyes. At night, they took turns keeping watch, though Xander insisted on taking the longer shifts. When Dolores was awake in the quiet hours, she often found herself wondering what was happening back at the ranch. Had Wilkins and his men arrived to find it deserted? Were they searching the hills for them? Or had the marshal already been notified and was on his way? On the 4th morning, Xander announced he would ride down to check the main trail for signs of activity. "I won't go far," he promised as he saddled his horse. "Just enough to see if there's been any traffic heading toward the ranch." "Be careful," Dolores said, unable to shake a feeling of unease. "Please." He kissed her quickly, then mounted his horse. "I'll be back before noon. Keep the rifle handy just in case." Dolores watched him ride away, the knot in her stomach tightening despite his assurances. To distract herself and Annie, she suggested they gather wild berries that grew near the spring. "Can we make a pie?" Annie asked excitedly as they collected the small purple berries in a tin pail. "I think we have just enough flour left," Dolores agreed. "It will be a surprise for Xander when he returns." They were so absorbed in their task that they didn't hear the approaching riders until they were alarmingly close. Dolores looked up to see 3 men on horseback emerging from the trees less than 50 yards away. "Annie," she said quietly but urgently, "I want you to run back to the cabin as fast as you can. Get inside and hide under the bottom bunk. Don't come out until I call for you." The child, sensing the seriousness of the situation, dropped her berries and ran without question. Dolores straightened, facing the approaching men with outward calm, though her heart pounded frantically. "Well, well," drawled the leader, a rough-looking man with a week's growth of beard. "Look what we found, boys, one of the missing Harrington girls." "Mr. Wilkins will be pleased," said another, younger and cleaner but with cold eyes that assessed Dolores like merchandise. "Where's Navarro?" demanded the third, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. "Not here," Dolores replied evenly, her mind racing. The rifle was in the cabin, but so was Annie. She couldn't risk leading these men there. "Don't matter," said the leader. "We were told to bring you and the little one back to town. Wilkins says you're his rightful property." "I am no one's property," Dolores stated firmly. "And neither is my sister." The leader dismounted, handing his reins to one of his companions. "Now, Miss Harrington, we can do this easy or hard, but you're coming with us either way." As he approached, Dolores backed away, trying to lead him away from the direction Annie had fled. "Mr. Wilkins has no claim on me. The auction was illegal and my debts to him were settled when he sold our family home." "That ain't how the banker sees it," the man replied, continuing to advance. "And he's paying good money for your return." Dolores's back pressed against a tree trunk. She was trapped with no weapon and nowhere to run, but she would not reveal Annie's location, no matter what happened. "I won't go willingly," she warned, the man's mouth twisted into an ugly smile. "Didn't expect you would, madam." He reached for her arm. The crack of a rifle shot split the air. Bark exploded from the tree just inches from the man's head, making him jerk back in alarm. "Next one goes between your eyes," called Xander's voice from somewhere in the trees. "Back away from her, now." The leader froze, then slowly raised his hands. "Now hold on, Navarro. We're just doing a job here." "A job?" Xander's voice was cold with fury. "Kidnapping women and children is what you call a job. Wilkins says she belongs to him," the younger man called from horseback. "Says you stole her away." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Xander replied. "And I suggest you leave my property before I decide trespassing deserves more than a warning shot." The leader glanced around, trying to locate Xander among the trees. "There's 3 of us and only one of you, Navarro. Are you certain of that?" Another voice called from the opposite direction, and Dolores recognized Franklin's distinctive drawl. The leader's confidence visibly wavered. "Look, we don't want no bloodshed. We're just doing what we were paid for." "Then consider yourselves paid for nothing," Xander said, finally revealing his position as he stepped from behind a large boulder, rifle aimed steadily at the leader. "Get back on your horse and ride out. Tell Wilkins that Dolores Harrington is under my protection, and if he wants to dispute that, he can take it up with the law." The standoff lasted several tense seconds before the leader backed toward his horse. "This ain't over, Navarro. Wilkins won't let it go." "Then he's a bigger fool than I thought," Xander replied. "Now go." As the three men mounted and rode away, Franklin emerged from the trees, his own rifle in hand. Xander hurried to Dolores's side, his face tight with concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, scanning her for any sign of injury. "No, I'm fine," she assured him. "But Annie, I'm here," came a small voice from behind them. Annie stepped out from behind a large rock, her face pale but determined. "I didn't hide in the cabin like you said. I followed you, and when I saw the bad men, I ran to find Xander." "She came flying down the trail like a little whirlwind," Franklin explained. "Good thing, too, or we might not have gotten here in time." Dolores knelt to embrace her sister, torn between relief and dismay at her disobedience. "You could have been hurt, Annie." "But I wasn't," Annie replied with the simple logic of childhood, "and I found help." Over the child's head, Dolores met Xander's eyes and saw her own mix of emotions reflected their pride in Annie's courage, fear at how close they had come to disaster, and determination that such a situation would never arise again. "We need to move," Xander said, helping Dolores to her feet. "Those men will report back to Wilkins and he might send more." "Where will we go?" Dolores asked. "Back to the cabin." "No," Franklin interjected. "The marshal's on his way, should be at the ranch by nightfall. Diego's there waiting for him with some of the neighboring ranchers who have joined our cause." "Then we'll head straight back," Xander decided. "Safety in numbers." As they walked back to the cabin to collect their things, Xander kept one arm around Dolores's waist, as if afraid she might disappear. "I shouldn't have left you," he said quietly. "You couldn't have known they would find us," she reassured him, "and if Annie hadn't come for you." "She's as brave as her sister," he said, glancing down at the child who walked ahead with Franklin, chattering about her adventure. "Or as reckless," Dolores replied with a small smile. "Either way, she's going to make one hell of a Navarro." His arm tightened around her waist. "If you still want that, after all this trouble I've brought you." Dolores stopped, turning to face him fully. "Xander Navarro, I love you. A few hired thugs aren't going to change that. If anything, today has only made me more certain that I want to be your wife." The relief on his face was palpable. He leaned down to kiss her briefly but fervently. "Then let's go home and make that official as soon as possible." The ride back to the ranch was tense but uneventful. They took a different route than the men who had confronted them, staying off the main trails and keeping to cover whenever possible. Annie rode in front of Dolores on her horse, while Xander and Franklin flanked them protectively. As they approached the ranch in the late afternoon, they were greeted by the sight of several horses and wagons in the yard. Men Dolores recognized from neighboring ranches stood on the porch, rifles in hand. Diego hurried out to meet them as they rode in. "Marshal's not here yet," he reported, "but we've had no trouble, no sign of Wilkins or his men." "Good." Xander dismounted, then helped Dolores and Annie down. "Let's get inside and make a plan." In the kitchen, ranchers and their wives had gathered, bringing food and offering support. Mrs. Peterson embraced Dolores warmly. "We were so worried when we heard what Wilkins was up to," she said. "That man has been a thorn in everyone's side for too long. Trying to take a woman and child by force was the last straw," her husband added grimly. "The whole county's turned against him now." As night fell, lanterns were lit and watches established. Dolores put Annie to bed, reassuring her that they were safe with so many friends around them. The child fell asleep quickly, exhausted by the day's events. Downstairs, Xander and the other men discussed strategies for dealing with Wilkins, their voices a low murmur from the sitting room. Dolores busied herself in the kitchen, preparing coffee for the night watch. A commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Hoofbeats approached and men's voices called out challenges. Xander moved to the door, rifle ready, but relaxed when he heard the response. "It's the Marshal," he announced, setting aside his weapon. Marshal Taylor was a tall, lean man with a weathered face and the watchful eyes of someone who had seen too much of human nature's darker side. He removed his hat as he entered the house, nodding to those gathered. "Quite a reception committee," he observed dryly. "Someone want to tell me what's going on?" For the next hour, the Marshal listened as Xander, Franklin, and others described the situation with Wilkins, from the original auction to the attempted abduction that morning. "That's a serious list of offenses," Taylor said when they had finished. "Fraud, false imprisonment, attempted kidnapping." He looked at Dolores. "Miss Harrington, would you be willing to testify to all this?" "Absolutely," she replied without hesitation. "Good." The Marshal stood, settling his hat back on his head. "I'll be riding into Caldwell at first light to have a conversation with Mr. Wilkins. In the meantime, I suggest you all get some rest. I doubt he'll try anything tonight, not with this many armed men around." As the gathering broke up, people finding places to sleep throughout the house and barn, Xander pulled Dolores aside. "There's something I need to ask you," he said, leading her onto the porch where they could speak privately. "What is it?" she asked, concerned by his serious expression. "Would you be willing to marry me tomorrow, before the Marshal goes to town?" The question surprised her. "Tomorrow, but why so soon?" "Because as my wife, you and Annie would have legal protection beyond question. Wilkins couldn't claim either of you as property or indentured servants." He took her hands in his. "And because I don't want to wait any longer to make you my wife." Dolores considered for only a moment before nodding. "Yes, tomorrow." His smile banished the worry from his face. "I'll speak to Reverend Bennett first thing in the morning." Word of the impending wedding spread quickly among their allies. By dawn, the women were helping Dolores prepare while the men cleared the sitting room for the ceremony. Mrs. Peterson produced a dress of pale blue silk from her wagon. "It was my daughter's," she explained. "She's married and living in Dallas now. I think it will fit you with just a few adjustments." Annie was beside herself with excitement, especially when told she would be allowed to hold the flowers during the ceremony. "Will I be a Navarro too?" she asked as Dolores helped her into her best dress. "Yes, sweetheart. Xander will be your brother by law and we'll all have the same name." "Good," Annie declared with satisfaction. "I like being a family." The simplicity of her statement brought tears to Dolores's eyes. Despite all they had endured, they had found a new family, a new home, and a new beginning. The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt. Reverend Bennett had arrived early, pleased to officiate what he called a union blessed by both heaven and practicality. The sitting room was crowded with ranchers, their wives, and the hands who had stood by them through the crisis. Xander waited by the fireplace, looking unusually nervous in his best shirt and clean denims. When Dolores appeared in the doorway, the blue silk dress complementing her dark hair and fair skin, his expression transformed to one of such open adoration that several of the women sighed audibly. With Annie proudly preceding her, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers, Dolores walked to Xander's side. The Reverend spoke of commitment, love, and the building of a family, words that resonated deeply after all they had experienced together. "I take you, Dolores Harrington, to be my lawful wife," Xander recited, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." When Dolores repeated the vows, her voice trembled slightly with emotion, but her eyes never left Xander's face. The gold band he placed on her finger had belonged to his mother, he told her, passed down to him for his first marriage and now given new meaning in this second chance at happiness. "By the authority vested in me," Reverend Bennett concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." The kiss they shared was both tender and promising, a seal on the vows they had made and a pledge of the life they would build together. Before the modest celebration that followed could properly begin, Marshal Taylor approached the newlyweds, hat in hand. "Congratulations to you both," he said sincerely. "I hate to interrupt your wedding day with business, but I wanted to let you know I'll be heading into town now to deal with Wilkins." "We understand," Xander replied, his arm around Dolores's waist, "and we appreciate your help, Marshal. Would you like some of us to ride with you?" Offered Mr. Peterson, the Marshal shook his head. "Better if I handle this officially. Too many armed men might escalate the situation." He looked at Xander. "I'll send word once it's settled." After the Marshal departed, the celebration continued with a wedding breakfast prepared by the neighboring women. Annie moved among the guests, proudly telling everyone she was now a Navarro, which brought smiles and affectionate pats on the head. As the morning progressed, most of the visitors began to depart, returning to their own ranches now that the immediate crisis seemed to be resolving. By noon, only the Double N hands remained, along with the Petersons, who insisted on staying until word came from the Marshal. It was mid-afternoon when a rider approached one of the young men from town who sometimes helped at the local livery. "Mr. Navarro," he called, dismounting in a rush. "Marshal Taylor sent me to tell you that Wilkins has been arrested." A cheer went up from those gathered on the porch. "Arrested for what exactly?" Xander asked, stepping forward. "Fraud, false imprisonment, and attempted kidnapping, just like you all said," the young man reported breathlessly. "But that ain't all." Once the Marshal started looking into Wilkins's affairs, others came forward. "Seems he's been running all sorts of schemes, forging documents, falsifying debts. Half the town's been affected somehow." "What will happen to him?" Dolores asked. "Marshal's taking him to Fort Worth for trial. Says with all the evidence and witnesses, Wilkins will be spending years behind bars." The messenger grinned. His wife's already filed for divorce, and the bank's being taken over by Mr. Thompson temporarily. The news brought a sense of closure that made the wedding day even more perfect. As the afternoon waned into evening, the last of their guests departed, leaving the new family alone in their home at last. That night, after Annie was tucked into bed with promises of a special outing the next day, Dolores and Xander stood on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky. "Mrs. Navarro," Xander said, testing the name with evident pleasure. "How does it feel?" "Right," Dolores replied simply, leaning into his embrace. "Like this is exactly where I'm meant to be." His arms tightened around her. "When I saw you on that auction block 4 months ago, I never imagined we'd end up here." "Fate has strange ways," she agreed, turning in his arms to face him. "But I'm grateful for every step that led us to each other, even the painful ones." "As am I." He brushed a strand of hair from her face with gentle fingers. "Now, shall we go inside, Mrs. Navarro? I believe we have a marriage to begin properly." Dolores smiled up at her husband, her heart full of love and hope for the future they would build together. "Yes, I think we shall." 5 years later, the Double N Ranch had prospered beyond what either Dolores or Xander had imagined possible. The main house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family. Annie, now 10 years old, and showing a remarkable aptitude for horsemanship, and the twins, Samuel and Joseph, boisterous 3-year-olds who kept everyone on their toes. The bank in Caldwell was now run by a fair-minded man from Fort Worth, and the town had grown with the arrival of the railroad 2 years prior. Elias Wilkins had been convicted and sentenced to 15 years in the state penitentiary, bringing justice to the many families he had wronged. On a warm September evening, similar to the one when Dolores had first arrived at the ranch, the family gathered on the expanded porch after supper. Annie was reading a book to her brothers, who listened with uncharacteristic attention. Xander sat in a rocking chair beside Dolores, who cradled their newest edition 1-month-old Elizabeth Margaret Navarro, named for both grandmothers they had never known. 5 years ago today, Xander remarked quietly, you and Annie arrived here. Dolores looked up from the sleeping infant in her arms, her eyes meeting his with the same warmth and love that had only deepened with time. The day that changed everything. For the better, he added, reaching over to touch his daughter's tiny hand. I never thought I could be this happy again. Nor I, she agreed. It wasn't an easy road, but it led us home. As the sun set over the Texas prairie, casting long shadows across the land they had built together, Dolores reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the desperation of the auction block to the fullness of the life they now shared, every step had been worth it. The family they had created born of loss, forged in adversity, and strengthened by love was a testament to the resilience of the human heart and its capacity for new beginnings, even in the wild and unforgiving frontier of the West. From tragedy had come triumph. From auctioned property to beloved wife and mother, from despair to joy. It was a transformation Dolores could scarcely have imagined that fateful day in Caldwell when a quiet cowboy had said, "I'll give you both a home." He had given them that and so much more: a family, a future, and a love that would endure long after the Wild West had been tamed.